Thanks so much, Michelle. So I'm Sarah Mason. All three of us will be sort of tag teaming this presentation, but I'm going to kick us off by talking about the development of the DOI Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap. And building on what Michelle just said, this has not just been our team working on this. We did have a team here from Duke. So Katie Warnell and Lydia Olander are on the line today, but we also have Aliana Wilson working from Duke with us. We worked very closely with the leads of the DOI Nature-Based Solutions Working Group, or the leads at the time that we were developing this, Lisa Kamara, Courtney Shoup, and Sarah Ward. And then we also had some great Nicholas School of the Environment students here at Duke supporting this project. But we co-produced this with the department, and we iterated with the lead of that work group and gathered feedback from the working group itself numerous times throughout the creation of the roadmap. So we just want to make sure that everyone knows that this was not just built by us. This was a process with the department throughout the entire development of the roadmap. So just so we're all starting with the same understanding of nature-based solutions, since it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, we're defining it here as actions that incorporate natural features and processes to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified ecosystems to address socio-environmental challenges, while also providing measurable co-benefits. So nature-based solutions benefit both people and the environment. And it includes activities like large landscape scale actions, so like watershed restoration, forest management, grassland restoration, things like that. But it can also include things at the local or parcel scale, so things like rain garden, biospheres. Nature-based solutions also includes both completely natural projects as well as those hybrid green-gray projects like green roofs or some types of living shorelines. So again, we're using nature-based solutions here as an umbrella term to encompass a wide array of projects that could fit this definition. But the key is that they need to provide benefits to both people and nature. And so we worked, again, very closely with our partners at the Department of the Interior to think about what a department-specific nature-based solutions roadmap would look like, and developed a vision for what we wanted this product to contain. So we really wanted the primary audience of the DOI Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap to be department personnel who plan and implement nature-based solutions projects. And we envisioned this as a high-level handbook that summarizes key information and points users to additional useful resources that have already been developed. In terms of utility for those department practitioners who we were targeting, we really saw four primary uses. We saw the roadmap as a way to identify nature-based solution strategies applicable to their context and aligned with their project goals. We wanted the roadmap to be a way to gather relevant information to get started with funding and project planning. We wanted to provide a way to find relevant resources, planning tools, and case studies. And then finally, a way to learn about nature-based solutions work going on both within and outside of the Department of the Interior. So the first version of the roadmap was released back in fall 2023 as a more than 500-page PDF document. And it contained a ton of great information, but as we all know, 500 pages of a PDF, it's not very searchable or very approachable. So we spent a year after that turning it into a more accessible web version that's interactive and allows users to more easily find the information that they want. So that web version was launched last year or last fall at COP29, and it contains 29 nature-based solution strategy overviews, more than 400 case studies of real-world nature-based solution strategies implemented on the ground. Also, more than 400 nature-based solutions tools and resources that can be used for implementing a project at various stages or informing a project. The roadmap also contains a set of key considerations needed for implementing any nature-based solutions project. And then it also includes guidance on how to think about green options for traditionally gray infrastructure. So the 29 nature-based solution strategies included in the roadmap span a wide array, of habitats. The list of strategies included was developed in conversation with the DOI Nature-Based Solutions Working Group, really focusing in on those strategies that were either most common or seen as most useful to the department. But we're also in the process of adding a few new strategies that should be uploaded this summer. So in the web version of the roadmap, the strategies are filterable by those habitat categories that were listed on the last slide. And so the strategies themselves are searchable not only by the types of habitats that they're relevant to, but also by the types of project goals that you want to achieve. So we thought some people might be coming to this roadmap really thinking about what they want their outcomes to be and not knowing necessarily exactly which nature-based solutions might help them get there. So that's one other way to find the relevant nature-based solution strategies you're looking for. So there are more than 30 different goals you can select from. And on the in the sort of screenshot of the nature-based solutions strategy search page, you can see an example drop-down menu that these goals, they range from things like creating jobs to enhancing aesthetics or even promoting food security. So once you use the filters and select an individual nature-based solutions strategy, each strategy page then links to a document that provides specific details on how that strategy is defined and an overview of the technical approach required to implement it, links to tools, trainings, and resources, details on those benefits and outcomes often achieved by using that strategy, and then finally, common barriers and possible solutions to overcoming them. Moving on to the case studies page. On the case studies page, there are also filters that help make it really searchable, as you're trying to find case studies that are most applicable to you. And so for the over 400 cases, you can filter again, not only by habitat type or those project outcomes and goals, but also by which nature-based solutions strategies were used and what state the project took place in, since we know some people are looking geographically for cases that are nearby. And so when you use these filters, the cases that meet your criteria will show up. And once you select a particular case, you can examine a summarized description of the case, its goals and primary outcomes, as well as a link to the original source where the case was found, so you can dive into more details. So just to look at where some of these cases were sourced from, we gathered them from a wide variety of sources, some of them coming from within the federal government, some of them coming from nonprofits or state governments. And while our library is by no means comprehensive, we were able to identify case write-ups from all the different nature-based solution strategies that are included in the roadmap. So this is just a little bit of a breakdown of the representation of the cases contained in that case study library. We found that the cases are pretty representative across geographies and across nature-based solution strategies, but there are some gaps. So this map on the left shows the number of case studies represented by each US state and territory. And you can see that coastal states are generally more represented than others, with relatively fewer cases available from the central part of the lower 48. Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories are also not that well represented. And you'll see the state with the most cases is actually Arizona, but this is due to the fact that the Conservation and Adaptation Resources Toolbox case study library, which was a major source for our cases, is actually housed there and is represented by a partnership with the University of Arizona. And so they're a little overrepresented, I would say. But we've added a few case studies to the library since this map was created, but the new cases didn't change the distributional pattern you see here. In terms of strategies, or the 29 nature-based solution strategies included, the graph to the right is up to date, showing the number of cases tagged with each individual nature-based solution strategy. Coastal marshes and non-tidal wetlands are, maybe unsurprisingly, the most well-represented strategies, followed by cases taking place in riverine systems and built environments or more urban environments. The strategy with the lowest number of cases written about it was green fire breaks, with only 4 cases describing that strategy. But generally, we were impressed to find that all 29 strategies were represented in the case studies identified. And one thing just to remember is that the case geographic and strategy-based distribution doesn't necessarily reflect the distribution of nature-based solutions projects going on. It simply represents the published communications about those projects that we were able to find. All right, moving on to the tools and resources page. The database of tools is separated or filterable by tool type, which includes things like informational resources or guidance documents. It also includes mapping tools, analysis tools, databases, or training opportunities. So all those different tool types. If you're looking for a particular type of tool, you can search by that. You can also search by the stage of the nature-based solutions project that you're working on. So if you're more at like the screening or siting phase of a project, you can find tools specific to that. There are tools specific to permitting, and then all the way through implementation, maintenance, and monitoring. You can find tools for all those phases of the project as well. Here you can also search by tools that are relevant for particular habitats. And then you can also filter by particular nature-based solution strategies. So if there's only one strategy you're interested in and you want to find all the tools related to that, you can do so. Within the, once you filter and find the tools that are most relevant to you, and you pull up the tool page will include the name of the tool, the authoring organization, a link to the full tool itself, either in PDF form or if it's some sort of web-based tool, it'll take you to that website. It tells you the relevant geography, so where the tool was developed for, as well as the level of expertise required to use or apply the tool. So just in terms of sources, the tools and resources included in the Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap strategy summaries were included here. The White House Nature-Based Solutions Resources Guide, we pulled relevant tools from there. And then we also pulled tools from the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative Resource Collection. So we recognize that this tool will never be completely comprehensive, or this tools and resources library will never be complete. But we definitely welcome anyone who finds a tool that's missing that they feel like should be included can get in touch with us. And on that page, there's an email address where you can send additional tools to. All right, so one of the other main pieces of the roadmap is what we call the key considerations. And this piece is linked on the main page, and it's really just a set of cross-cutting principles. And this is the information that we identified as relevant for all nature-based solutions projects. And we wanted to provide resources and a summary of the topics shown here, really to provide a way to introduce the foundational concepts that underlie all nature-based solutions projects. So each page outlines kind of a wide swath of topics that practitioners need to be thinking about, especially in the early stages of planning nature-based solutions projects. All right, the real last feature that I'll go over before we kind of wrap up this roadmap summary section is talking about the sort of green-gray infrastructure content on the website. So there's a page linked on the main roadmap page that talks about how gray infrastructure could be either replaced, augmented, or enhanced by adding green infrastructure features. So it allows users to examine common issues that gray infrastructure has historically been used for. So things like addressing coastal erosion or flooding, addressing things like urban stormwater or heat. And then the page provides direct connections to the green infrastructure alternatives that could also be used to address those issues. The green-gray content also includes tables that compare nature-based solutions with gray infrastructure alternatives. So you can see here the example of addressing urban heat using either urban greening through tree planting versus the gray option of installing cool roof coatings. And so the table, and there's a whole series of these, compares that green versus gray option in terms of installation costs, the type of maintenance each strategy requires, and the outcomes you can expect from using each of these strategies. as well as some of the key site suitability factors for each. So again, this is just one example, but we have comparison tables for all different kinds of gray versus green infrastructure, including for coastal protection, stormwater management, flooding, as well as aquifer recharge. I won't go into all the details here, but we do have some statistics to help give a sense of which pieces of the roadmap are being used most. So since the launch last November, the web-based roadmap page has had over 15,000 views. And after the homepage, people tend to gravitate towards the nature-based solution strategy search or the case study search. So we still have a few components of the roadmap left to build. We're working to identify existing tool and resource gaps to determine which types of tools could be developed to make nature-based solutions implementation easier. So we're taking a look at those 400 tools and resources that we already gathered that are contained in the roadmap and seeing which nature-based solution strategies or project phases or combinations of both might not currently have associated tools. To help kind of identify where new tools might be created. One other piece we're still working on is we're updating the funding mechanisms page to make it more up to date. There were a bunch of federal opportunities for nature-based solutions that are no longer active, and so we want to try to provide the most up-to-date information on funding that we can. And finally, we're working on developing resources related to metrics. This is a topic that we've heard a lot of interest in from many different sort of corners of the nature-based solutions ecosystem. And we're working directly with groups within the federal government focused on developing nature-based solutions metrics resources to see how we can augment and expand on the work that's already going on. So there's a group doing this at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a group at the Department of the Interior level, as well as others. And so to wrap up the sort of DOI nature-based solutions roadmap, and sort of transitioning more to this topic of nature-based solutions metrics, our team at Duke also has some related work that's not currently part of the roadmap website, but is certainly informing the metrics framework that we'll be developing. And so we felt that some of this other project work might be of interest here. So I'm going to hand things off to Katie and then Lydia to give a brief introduction of that other work.
Thanks, Sarah. You can go ahead to the next slide. So just to take a step back, our work on metrics and understanding the effectiveness of nature-based solution by measuring metrics really goes back to what we've been hearing from various groups over the last couple of years about the need for more information about how effective nature-based solutions are. There's a whole list of different reasons that this information is needed. Just to highlight a couple that we're hearing, specifically project evaluation, being able to tell how well projects are working and whether they're achieving the goals that they set out to. Which can also be really helpful for informing design and engineering standards, that we can make sure that nature-based solutions projects are being built in ways that kind of maximize their ability to achieve the goals and address the issues that we need them to. There are a number of groups, a couple of them are listed on the slide on the left here, that are specifically working on accelerating implementation of nature-based solutions to address different issues. And these groups have also indicated that they would be really interested in having better information about effectiveness for these projects. And the Google trend here is a little bit more general, but you can see just the real explosion of interest in nature-based solutions, even just in the last couple of years. So with this in mind, you can go to the next slide. Last summer, we wanted to take a look at what information is currently available about nature-based solutions projects and specifically how effective they are. So we know there are a lot of existing databases that have some information about either literature that's been published related to nature-based solutions. We found 6 of those. And or about the projects themselves. We found 21 project databases that have lists of projects. So we wanted to understand what information was available already in those databases and whether it was useful for analyzing nature-based solutions effectiveness. And as part of that, we also looked for where there were gaps in coverage, either in what type of information was available or in what geographies and what types of nature-based solutions were represented. Next slide. So to start with the databases themselves, we went through those 6 literature databases and I should say 21 project databases to look for certain characteristics that would make them useful for evaluating effectiveness. So I won't go through all of these. We can point you to the full report if you're interested. But one thing we found was that most of the project databases did not actually have any effectiveness information. And so they really weren't usable at all to evaluate effectiveness. Some of the literature databases did have some of that information, but those are just kind of smaller in general and didn't have as much project-specific information. We also found some limitations in just the usability of the information in these databases. A lot of it came down to not being able to download the databases, which makes it really hard to combine them to look across projects that might show up in different databases to do kind of that higher level assessment that we wanted to do. There are also a lot of issues around updating. Many of the databases don't seem to be regularly updated, or it's really hard to tell how frequently they are updated. And then on the kind of coverage and level of detail, we saw a lot of variability in how detailed the databases were in their descriptions of the nature-based solutions projects. In a lot of cases, this made it really hard to tell if the 2 projects were actually the same type or not, because one would be described very specifically and one very generally. So based on all of this, we just saw a lot of limitations in the ability to use this information for effectiveness, although it's still, these databases do have a lot of useful information just about what projects are being done and where, and some kind of more general background information on those projects. Next slide. So we also broke down the entries across the project databases, which is kind of the top square here, and the literature databases on the bottom, in terms of what kind of habitats they are related to. We initially intended to break this down by nature-based solutions strategy, like Sarah was talking about in the roadmap. But again, there wasn't enough information, and a lot of the projects didn't have enough kind of specific information to be able to tell what type they were. So we were only able to do it to the habitat type. You can see that the project databases are really dominated by coastal projects and built environments, so kind of those urban projects with kind of a little bit of a scattering of projects of other types. And then conversely, the literature databases are actually very dominated by agricultural sorry, not projects, but publications related to agricultural best management practices. And then there's some on coastal and kind of floodplain or river-based, nature-based solutions, but not much in any other project types. And as Sarah said, this related to the assessment of what's in our tools and our case studies databases. These distributions don't represent, what's actually on the ground, but just what's being either provided in these databases or written up in the scientific literature. So it's got some blind spots in terms of some of these other types of nature-based solutions. Next slide. We also look by geography. So the left map here is the number of projects in the project databases in each state. And on the right is the number of publications in those literature databases. The darker states have more projects or more publications available. So it's a similar story here, I would say, to the case studies. There's a lot of coverage in the coastal states and not much in the middle. Again, this is partially due to how projects are maybe described or written up, where maybe some of the agriculture and forestry projects that might be happening in the more middle part of the US aren't being described or characterized as nature-based solutions, and so are a little bit harder for us to find in these searches. Next slide. So we've also seen a lot of similar work that has kind of looked at nature-based solutions projects, looked at people trying to evaluate nature-based solutions and their effectiveness. And we've seen others pointing out similar needs for better evaluation and for better sharing of that information about these projects. There's a special issue in the journal Nature-Based Solutions last year that looked at attempts to collect evidence around disaster risk reductions by nature-based solutions. They had some really good specific examples, but also kind of this lack of more general information that can be used for a larger scale evaluation. And then the bottom report is one that came out last year that looked at evidence for ecosystem services generally, as well as hazard risk reduction specifically by nature-based solutions, and made some recommendations that we not only need to better document how well these are performing and improve the monitoring and evaluation, kind of close the knowledge gap side, but we also need to make sure that that information is being shared effectively so that it can be used, among other ways, to develop these engineering standards and reference materials so that we can improve implementation of nature-based solutions on the ground in the future. Next slide. I'm going to hand it off to Lydia to talk more about our ongoing metrics work to try to address some of these gaps.
Great, thank you, Katie. So building on all that Katie said, we have been interested in understanding the effectiveness of nature-based solutions and started a project about a year ago now in partnership with the CASC and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And next slide. While we are focused in the Southeast because of the CASC, I think the work that we're doing is relevant more broadly. We have focused in on two types of nature-based solutions to narrow the scope of the work and allow us to dive in more deeply. We've started with coastal salt marsh and mangrove systems and the various different kinds of projects that can reduce risk in these. And we're focused on hazard attenuation, so this risk reduction benefits in particular is project outcomes, as well as the species and habitat benefits these projects provide. And we've given a lot of background for why we're focused on hazard attenuation, but there's also interest in making sure that there's benefits for both people and the environment. And so trying to understand these biodiversity and habitat benefits are also critical. And that is the work that the Fish and Wildlife Service is leading with us. And so we're going to focus mostly today on what we're doing on the hazard attenuation side. And then we'll give a little update on the biodiversity piece. And then hopefully at some point, Green Todd Farrand could come and speak about that more if you're interested. Next slide. So this work also is being co-designed and co-developed with the critical partners. And so you can see a list of some of the bigger institutions that we see as potentially institutionalizing some of what we come up with here. So that includes the Army Corps of Engineers and the American Society of Civil Engineers that are developing standards. It also includes groups like NOAA and the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative and NIFWIF, all of whom are doing projects in this space and funding projects in these areas. So hopefully those groups will be kind of key in implementing what comes out of this work. But we also are working with a lot of different folks from this list we have here for people that are developing projects on the ground, that are doing some of the monitoring, putting together design documents, funders who may be requesting data like NIFWIF, data managers who are collecting the data, and researchers who are doing the analysis and evaluating effectiveness. So we have all these folks that have been part of our kind of virtual engagements and outreach. Next slide. So to give a better sense of what type of measurement we're doing, we have a lot of talk about what the metrics are. And so just want to clarify, we're focused here on project scale metrics, and we are measuring what we call as outputs. So we're looking at kind of the ecological and biophysical impacts of a nature-based solutions project. And we also need to understand how the projects were designed, so the input metrics. What are these activities that are leading to these outputs? So that's all the information we're collecting, but the goal here is to get to those social and economic outcomes. We're not doing that part. The idea here is that if you collect all this data, then you can measure or model those outcomes that we care about. Next slide. So when we think about risk, there are three different components people talk about: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. When we think about the role that nature-based solutions play, they are really impacting the level of the hazard. So for example, if we're working on a salt marsh and restoring a salt marsh to an area, that can reduce wave height, and therefore it attenuates the hazard and makes it lower risk. And similarly, if we're working on a wetland inland and it's storing additional water and reducing the flow of water downstream, it's reducing the level of that hazard. So that's really the kind of the lever that nature-based solutions has, so that hazard attenuation piece. Next slide. So what we've been thinking about is, how do we get to understanding effectiveness? So kind of large scale analysis across lots of different projects to really understand how we design projects, where those projects are cited, and what kinds of events those projects experience in terms of extreme weather, for example, and how those affect the effectiveness, how those result in changes in the effectiveness of these nature-based solutions. So which things are more effective under which designs, for example. In order to get there, we feel like there's a whole series of things that have to happen. So this is a kind of that process. So project teams need to collect baseline data on projects. And ideally, once a project is installed, they would also do some short-term measurements about the as-built conditions of that project. And then that project data is collected in such a way that it can be shared with researchers. We recognize that this data has all other uses, though. It is important for adaptive management, for estimating, like modeling potential project benefits and telling those stories. But in order to really get at effectiveness, we need this data to move over into the kind of research community so that they can go back to these projects over time in 3, 5, 10 years, maybe after hurricanes or other events, and evaluate how those projects are doing and how they work to actually reduce the hazards over time. And so we need that data collected, and we need it collected in a way that it can be synthesized across projects. So we can do meta-analysis and other types of syntheses to really understand what's working and what's not in these nature-based solutions. So that's the gold star there. That's what we're aiming for. So we wanted to give you a little bit more detail on kind of what this looks like. And so the types of information we want collected in the metrics here are things like project description metrics. These come from project teams or project design documents to provide details about the project itself. We also need project performance metrics that are measured after a project is in the ground. And so these could be as-built baseline information that's collected, as well as measurements by researchers 3, 5, 10 years later after implementation to evaluate effectiveness. We also need information on the local context or condition. So these are usually measured during project siting and implementation, but also would potentially be measured later by researchers. These are used to do project evaluation, help with the project evaluation. So using as explanatory variables, or used to calibrate models. There also may be special cases where information on disturbances are collected. So you may want information on, how many hurricanes have gone through, or big storm surge events, or things like that. We also need information on the hazard attenuation outcomes that should be measured by researchers. So this would be measuring things like the wave attenuation changes. And again, this is on the research side of things. And we have a virtual workshop coming up to get feedbacks on the metrics we're putting together related to the inland flooding. We've already done that for the coastal piece. But if folks are interested in providing input and participating in our virtual workshop on the metrics related to inland nature-based solutions and hazard attenuation, please let us know, and we'd be happy to get in touch and give you some more details on that. All right, and if you just click, I wanted to highlight that the first two metric categories are frequently measured by project teams that are implementing these projects. And in order to make collection of that data easier and make that more streamlined and standardized, and that standardized piece is really important for us to be able to synthesize the data later to do these large-scale analyses, we are starting to put together a project template. And this is next slide, please. Yeah, this is the idea is to create a kind of a standard, relatively streamlined way to collect data, maybe using a user-friendly web form that would collect these critical data using kind of the same semantics in terms of what the nature-based solutions are, what the activities are, so that we can then align and aggregate the data in the future. We are also planning a virtual meeting to get feedback on this data template. So again, if you're interested in participating, we'd love to have your engagement and input in that process. Next slide. So I'm going to jump here to the biodiversity side of things and just give you a little sneak peek into what Todd is working on. So he's been having a series of conversations with various experts inside and outside the Fish and Wildlife Service. And one of the things they've been talking about is what are kind of the principles for the way they think about this. And so they have some thoughts here about how best to define biodiversity and how to assess biodiversity in this context. And so here are some of those details, like that they need to think about the desired community of plants and animals. So how do invasive or exotic species get incorporated as counting against biodiversity kind of benefits? And in assessing biodiversity, want to look at a kind of composite community metrics, not looking at a single score, measuring a subset of species that represent healthy function, and protocols that are tailored to the ecosystem or the taxa that are relevant. Next slide. At this point, there's a focus around building on existing approaches, and one of the best, given conversations that Todd has led so far, is the Society for Ecological Restoration's Ecological Recovery Wheel. And they see this as a good starting point. There's 6 different categories of the types of metrics under each of those. They score from 1 to 5. And they have a variety of different metrics you could measure. For example, for species composition, scoring a 1 would mean that native species are just starting to colonize, representing less than or equal to 5% of the area, whereas a 5 would be given if there's a high diversity of native species representing 95% or more of the area restored. So they're categorical kind of representations that can be used to give a 1 to 5 score. And the idea here is that this is a minimum standard and a good starting place that everyone could measure these 6 categories around this wheel. But you know, and there may be some sub attributes metrics that would be more important than others to measure. And in addition, there's discussion about what they could do that might even be better than this. So the next slide. There's a kind of a deeper dive into kind of more detailed metrics that might be important in certain ecosystems. So right now, as we said, we focused on this coastal ecosystems and then these inland wetland and watershed ecosystems. So those are the areas where he's also focusing and thinking about what are additional specific metrics that might be important. All right, next slide. So that's the end of our presentation. And I forgot to mention, Todd is putting together a report, and there'll be a draft that he'll be sharing around. So there's going to be opportunity for input on that piece as well. So I'll stop there, and we can turn it over to Michelle for questions.